Augustin Devereux was not sleeping. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even, but behind that stillness his mind moved the way it always moved, cold and exact, tallying a column that never balanced. His frame filled the wingback chair by the tall shuttered windows of his study on Esplanade Avenue, one hand loose on the armrest, his chest rising in a rhythm so patient it could fool anyone standing in the doorway. To a stranger, he was simply a tired man dozing through a humid afternoon. He was 39 years old, and there was not a cotton press, a shipping berth, or a bank ledger on the New Orleans wharves that did not answer, sooner or later, to his name. Vessels sailed when he permitted them to sail. Merchants prospered or vanished depending on which side of his account books they stood. Aldermen lowered their voices when they said Devereux. And yet the man an entire port city feared was afraid of exactly one thing. He was afraid of believing in another human being. That fear was why the leather billfold on the mahogany side table had been left exactly where it was, a fold of banknotes showing carelessly at its edge. $3,000 in currency that could rebuild a poor family's whole year. It looked precisely like what it was meant to look like, the forgetfulness of a rich man dozing in his chair. He called it, privately, his accounting of souls. He had run this small performance for 15 years, in this chair, with his eyes shut and his money in plain sight, and 15 years had taught him the same story, over and over. The held breath. The soft creak of a floorboard. The furtive fingers. Housemaids, bookkeepers, dockhands who had sworn their loyalty on their mothers' graves. Sooner or later, they always reached for it. Outside the shuttered windows, the sky over the Mississippi had gone the color of a bruise, the first growl of an autumn hurricane rolling somewhere out past the delta. Inside, a ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, stirring air heavy with magnolia and river damp. Mahogany shelves climbed to the crown molding, stacked with ledgers instead of novels. In the hallway, a grandfather clock counted the silence, patient as a held breath. There is something quietly sad about a man who builds traps to catch the worst in people. He believes he is testing their hearts. In truth, he has simply given up on finding anything else there. Augustin was not searching for honesty anymore. He was searching for proof that he had been right to stop believing in it, proof that every hand stretched toward him wanted his money or his throat. Because Augustin Devereux had not been born suspicious. He had been made that way, carefully, by the very man who had once called him son and, in the end, had signed away his father's life to buy his own peace. And it was through the hum of the fan and the tick of the hallway clock that he heard it, the study door easing open, footsteps deliberate and heavy, followed by another set of footsteps, very small. The woman who entered was Margot Leroux, the newest addition to the household staff, 27 years old, hired only 3 weeks before. Augustin kept his eyes shut, but he did not need to see her. He had read her file the evening the housekeeper hired her, the way he read the file of everyone who crossed his threshold, and he remembered every line of it. Her husband, Baptiste Leroux, had worked the cotton wharves down at the public belt. 2 years earlier, on a wet October morning, a winch cable had given way under a swinging bale, and Baptiste had not lived long enough to see a doctor. He had left his wife a stack of unpaid rent, a 2-room flat in the Faubourg Marigny with a roof that leaked, and a 6-year-old daughter named Camille. Those were the small footsteps now crossing the threshold behind her mother. It was a Thursday, and the parish schools had shut their doors ahead of the coming storm. A woman like Margot could not afford to lose a day's wages to find someone to mind a child. Augustin knew, because very little happened under his roof without his knowledge, that she had gone to the housekeeper that morning and begged to bring the girl along just this once, swearing the child would sit as still as a shadow. The housekeeper had agreed, reluctantly, with a warning sharp as a blade. If Mr. Devereux so much as laid eyes on that girl, both of them would be back on Dauphine Street by supper. And so the whisper now trembling somewhere near the doorway belonged to a woman carrying her entire life balanced in 2 hands. "Camille, sit right here on the rug, in the corner," Margot breathed, her voice barely rising above the hum of the fan. "Don't move. Don't touch a single thing. Mr. Devereux is resting in that chair, and if you wake him, I lose my position, and tonight we have nowhere to sleep. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama," came the answer, small and obedient, carrying a weight no 6-year-old voice should have had to carry. There is a detail worth pausing on, a detail Augustin heard but did not yet understand. The mother had said, "Don't touch anything." She had not said, "Don't take anything." In Margot's heart, her daughter had never once been a danger to another person's fortune. Her fear was not that Camille might steal. It was the older, quieter fear of the poor standing inside a rich man's rooms, the fear of people who understand they can be ruined simply for existing where they do not belong. That was the line between suspicion and love, and the man pretending to sleep in the wingback chair was not yet awake enough, in any sense that mattered, to see it. "Mama has to see to the linens, 10 minutes. I'll be right back," Margot whispered. "Be good. Please be good." The door clicked shut. Footsteps faded down the gallery. And now there were only 2 people left in the study, the most feared man on the New Orleans waterfront and a 6-year-old girl in a faded cotton dress. The silence stretched. The fan turned. The clock ticked on down the hall. Augustin kept his breathing slow and perfect, but every nerve in his body had gone still and listening. He waited for what always came, the creak of a drawer, the rustle of paper, the careful little shuffle of small feet exploring a wealth they had never been allowed to touch. Children were curious by nature, he had always believed, and poor children hungered hardest for what they had never had. But Camille did not move. A full minute passed. His neck had begun to ache from holding the same position, a dull fire spreading toward his skull. He did not break character. He had played this role too many times to ruin it now. Then he heard it, the faintest rustle of cotton. The girl was standing. Small footsteps crossed the rug, slow, hesitant, 1 step, then a pause, then another, as if each one had to be weighed before it was taken. They stopped beside the chair. Augustin knew exactly what had drawn the child's eye. The billfold lay inches from his open, relaxed hand, close enough for a girl half his size to reach without stretching. He could feel her presence beside him now, small and warm in the humid air, could almost hear her breathing over the fan. In his mind, the old script began to play, the one he had rehearsed 100 times with 100 different people. She would reach out. She would take the bills, tuck them into her pocket with clumsy fingers. Then he would open his eyes, catch her in the act, and by nightfall her mother would be gone from this house. One more test failed, one more brick added to the wall around his heart. Trust no one, not the desperate, not the small, no one. He waited for the rustle of paper. It never came. Instead, Augustin felt something no 15 years of tests had prepared him for. A small hand, damp with the day's heat, light as a moth, pressed briefly against his forehead. "He is checking whether I'm well," he thought, his mind racing behind closed eyes. The hand withdrew. Then he heard a sigh, strangely heavy for such a small chest, and a sound he could not place at all. Fabric against fabric, a folding motion, quick and practiced. A moment later something soft and cool settled against the side of his face, a scrap of linen, damp from the water pitcher on the sideboard. It was Camille's own handkerchief, wrung out and pressed gently to his temple, and she was patting it there with the careful concentration of someone tending a sick relative. Then she whispered, so quietly it nearly disappeared under the fan, as though speaking only to herself. Mama says when somebody's hot like this, in this heat, it might be the fever. You have to cool them down quick, before it takes hold. Augustine's heart went still. This was not in the script. None of it. The girl was not looking at the money at all. She was looking at him. Then came a soft slide of paper across wood, and his whole body tensed. There it is, he thought bitterly. Now that she believes I'm too weak to notice, now she takes it. But the sound was wrong. It was not money being snatched. It was the billfold being nudged, slowly, deliberately, away from the table's restless edge, where the ceiling fan's draft had begun to lift its corner toward the safety of the lamp's heavy iron base. Not hidden. Not taken. Only protected, so it would not blow to the floor. Then she bent, picked up the ledger that had slid halfway off his lap, wiped a smear of dust from its cover with her sleeve, and set it neatly beside the billfold. Safe now, she murmured, and padded back to her corner of the rug, pulling her knees up to her chest. Augustin risked opening his left eye, the barest sliver, hidden behind his lashes, and what he saw unsettled him to his core. A thin, sunburned child in a dress 2 sizes too large, her bare feet dusty at the heels, and yet her small face was set with such gravity, such focused, unhurried care, that any grown man watching might have felt ashamed of himself. Here is a thing a 6-year-old understood, and that the most powerful man on the wharves had long since forgotten. Kindness does not ask whether the person receiving it has earned it. Camille had not weighed whether the man in the chair was rich or poor, cruel or kind, worth the trouble. She had simply seen someone who looked unwell and done the one small thing within her power. Grown people learn 1,000 reasons not to bother. Children have not learned them yet, and sometimes that not yet knowing is the nearest thing to wisdom the world has to offer. Augustin lay motionless, his mind scoured empty. He had built a trap to catch a thief. What had walked into it instead was a small, ordinary act of mercy, and somewhere behind a wall that had stood 15 years, unbending as iron, the first hairline crack appeared. A single question pressed against it, silent and insistent. Why didn't you take it? I know exactly how little you have. Why didn't you take the money? Before he could begin to make sense of what was rising in his chest, an old memory broke loose and came flooding back uninvited, one he had spent 15 years trying to keep buried. It was a wet evening at Cotton Press No. 4, down by the old turning basin. Augustin was 24 then, a half-step behind his father through the rain, walking toward a meeting that was never meant to end in fire. Waiting inside stood Léon Broussard, who had eaten at their table 1,000 times, who had called Etienne Devereux his oldest friend, who had held Augustin as an infant before Augustin's own mother had. Léon Broussard, who that night stepped aside from the warehouse door so that Corbin Rousseau's men could come through it. Augustin remembered the precise half-second his father understood what was happening, the way the old man's shoulders did not flinch, only settled, as if beneath a weight that had finally arrived after years of waiting. Then the fire took the building's east wall in a roar that swallowed every other sound. Etienne Devereux carried his son out through a collapsing doorway on his own back and did not live to see the following dawn. He had used his final strength not to name his killers, but to grip his son's collar and pull him close. "Listen to me," the old man had rasped. "Don't let what happened here turn you into a man who trusts no one. A man who trusts no one has already died. He simply hasn't noticed yet. Promise me, Augustin." "I promise you, Papa," Augustin had sobbed. "I promise." Etienne Devereux died before sunrise in the back of a hired cart on Chapatula Street, and Augustin broke that promise, not in a day, not in a year, but slowly, the way rust works through the hull of a ship. The 15 years that followed were years of dismissals on the thinnest suspicion, of trusted faces studied like enemy maps, of tests, the billfold on the table, the unlocked strongbox, the whispered secret past to see who would carry it further. And every single time, someone failed him. Until today. Until Camille. Here is the truth about promises. The hardest one to keep is the one you actually want to keep. Augustin had not betrayed his father because he was a cruel man. He had betrayed it because the grief was too large to carry, and because bitterness, strange as it sounds, is a kind of shelter. Once you decide the whole world is rotten, nothing it does can ever surprise you again. Bitterness is the armor of a heart that once loved too openly. The trouble with armor is that it keeps out the warmth along with everything else. Augustin surfaced slowly from that memory, the way a man surfaces from deep water. The damp handkerchief still lay against his temple, thin and cheap and cooling, and it carried more comfort than every imported cigar and crystal decanter in that study combined. And only now, after 15 years, did he notice that his own hands, folded loosely in his lap, had gone cold despite the heat pressing against the shutters. He did not know how long he lay there, a minute, 5, 10, with that question still bleeding through the crack in the wall. Why didn't she take it? He needed an answer. He needed to look into that child's eyes and find the angle, the calculation, the price he was certain lived somewhere inside every person alive. Because if it truly was not there, then 15 years of his life had been built on a lie he had told himself to survive. He never got the chance to decide on his own. The study door burst open. Margot rushed in, breathless, her face pale as the muslin curtains. She had clearly run the whole gallery without slowing for a single step. Her eyes swept the room in one heartbeat, first the corner, where Camille sat curled with her knees to her chest, then the chair, where her daughter's damp handkerchief still rested against the sleeping man's temple, and finally the side table, the billfold sitting untouched against the lamp. Her hand flew to her mouth. In the mind of a woman who had spent 2 years learning exactly how merciless the world could be, the worst possibility assembled itself in an instant. The girl had disturbed him. The girl had touched something that should never have been touched. "Camille," she hissed, seizing her daughter's arm and pulling her upright. "What did you do? Why is your handkerchief on him? Did you touch that money?" Camille looked up, eyes wide, bewildered. "No, Mama." He looked sick. "I just wanted to help. And the money was about to blow off the table, so I moved it somewhere safe." "Oh God," Margot's voice cracked, tears rising before she could stop them. "He's going to wake up. He'll turn us both out. I told you not to move." Augustin let out a low, deliberate groan and shifted in the chair, as if only now stirring. Margot froze. In one motion, she pulled Camille against her chest and began backing toward the door, rigid as a woman who has just seen a snake in the grass. He opened his eyes slowly, blinked as a man surfacing from an afternoon doze, and let his gaze settle on the two of them huddled by the doorway. His dark brows drew together. "What is the meaning of this racket?" he said, his voice like gravel over stone. "Can a man not rest in his own house?" "I am so terribly sorry, sir." Margot's words tumbled over one another, her head bowing. "I was only tending the linens. This is my daughter. Her school was closed for the storm. I had no one to leave her with. We're leaving this instant, sir. Please don't dismiss me. I need this position." Augustin's gaze traveled, unhurried, from the mother to the billfold resting safely against the lamp, exactly where the girl had pushed it, then to the child half hidden behind her mother's skirts, trembling now, not from fever, but from fear. "Come here, little one," he said. Margot's hands clamped down on her daughter's shoulders. "Sir, she meant no harm. She is only 6 years old. I swear to you I said, come here." The room went quiet except for the fan. Camille peeled her mother's fingers gently from her shoulder, one small hand over the larger trembling one, a gesture that seemed to belong to someone 3 times her age, and walked forward, step by step, until she stood at the edge of his knee. He studied her the way he had studied 1,000 faces across negotiating tables, searching for the flicker of a lie. "You put your handkerchief on my head." "Why?" "I'm a stranger to you, girl. I own half the wharves on this river. Why would you waste your kindness on me?" Camille looked down at her bare feet, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Then she raised her eyes, clear and entirely without calculation. "Because you looked sick, sir. My mama says sickness doesn't care if you're rich. Sick is still sick." Augustin went completely still. Sick is still sick. A truth so plain it landed like a blow. His whole life he had drawn hard lines through the world, the rich and the poor, the trustworthy and the dangerous, and a barefoot child had just erased every one of them in 5 words. But he was not finished testing. 15 years had taught him that one honest moment proves nothing on its own. His eyes drifted to a small stain of ink spreading across the desk blotter where the ledger had slipped earlier, and he pointed at it slowly. "That ledger," he said, his voice dropping into the register that had ended careers. 20 years of accounts ruined. He let the silence sit, then delivered the lie without a flicker. $500 to have it copied and restored. He looked at Margot. $500. Margot's face strained of what little color remained. "I don't have that, sir. I haven't even been paid this month." "Please, take it from my wages. I'll work every Sunday, every holiday, whatever you need. Just please don't punish my daughter for this." Augustin's eyes narrowed slightly. 15 years of tests, and he had watched grown men sell out their oldest friends for far less than this. He turned his gaze to the girl. "And you," he said, flat and hard. "You caused this. What do you have to say for yourself?" Camille did not cry. That was the first thing that struck him. She reached into the pocket of her dress, dug for a moment, and opened her small hand. Resting in her palm was a little wooden dove, its wings worn smooth, a leather cord looped through a hole at its neck. "I don't have $500, sir," she said softly. "But I have this. My papa carved it for me before he went to heaven. He told me if I ever got scared, I should hold it tight and he'd fly to me." She placed the little dove carefully on the desk beside the ruined ledger. "You can have my papa's bird, sir, to pay for it. It's my very best thing, but I don't want you angry at my mama." Augustin did not move. He could not move. He stared at the small carved wings, and for the second time that afternoon, something in his chest that had been sealed shut for 15 years split open, quiet and total. He thought of the $3,000 sitting untouched on the side table, money he had staged as bait, money he would never have noticed losing. Then he looked at the worn little bird beside it. This child was offering the one irreplaceable thing she owned to settle a debt she did not truly owe. She was 6 years old, and she understood something about giving that he, with all his ledgers and warehouses, had never once learned. Here is the moment worth pausing on longer than any other. Camille was not giving from abundance. She was giving away the only thing she had left of her father. There is a vast distance between generosity that costs nothing and generosity that costs everything, and the second kind is the only kind that is ever truly real. Augustin reached out, slowly, and picked up the little dove. His hand, the hand that had signed away men's fortunes without a tremor, was shaking. "You," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of gravel, "is left almost nothing but a whisper. You would give me this over an ink stain." Camille tilted her head. "Is it enough, sir?" Augustin closed his eyes. Behind them paraded 15 years of faces, partners, foremen, old friends, every one of them reaching toward him, and every one of them reaching to take. Not one had ever stood before him with open hands, offering everything they had. "Yes," he whispered, opening his eyes. "It's enough. More than enough. He sank back into the chair, and something in his shoulders let go that had been held tight for a decade and a half. The performance was over. He could not wear the mask for one more second. "Sit down," he said to Margot, and his voice had changed entirely, no sharpness left in it at all, only the tiredness of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Please. I have a confession to make." He turned the little dove slowly between his fingers. "The ledger isn't ruined. It's only smudged. And I wasn't asleep. I never was. I set that money out on purpose, sir," Margot whispered, going still. "You were testing us." "Yes," he admitted, without excuse, without softening it. "I stopped believing anyone could be trusted a long time ago. I test everyone who comes into this house. I have for 15 years. He looked at Camille. "But this child covered my head because she thought I was sick and then offered me her father's memory to spare you a punishment I invented." He wiped at his eyes with the back of one hand, making no attempt to hide it. "I have more money than any man on this river needs, and I am the poorest man I know. And you," he said to Margot, "you have nothing, and you have raised a little queen." Then Camille's small brow furrowed, genuinely puzzled, because in her world no one pretended illness to trap another person. Such a thing simply did not exist to her yet. "So you were only pretending to be sick, sir?" she asked. Augustin opened his mouth to answer, and the girl went on before he could, thinking aloud in that plain, unguarded way children have. "But your hands were really cold. I felt them under the handkerchief." Augustin went very still. It was true. His hands truly had gone cold despite the heat. The trap had been false, but the loneliness underneath it had never been anything but real, and a 6-year-old girl had seen straight through 15 years of performance to find it, simply because she had never once cared about the performance in the first place. He rose from the chair, crossed to where Margot sat frozen on the edge of the settee, and held out the billfold. "Take it," he said. She shook her head, pulling back. "No, sir, I don't want your money. I only want to keep my position, to earn our way honestly." "Take it," he said again, more gently. "This is not charity. Consider it tuition, for the lesson your daughter just taught me." He knelt, with some difficulty, until his eyes were level with Camille's. "The dove is mine now, fair trade," he said, and a real smile touched his mouth, the first and longer than he could remember. "But I find I don't know the first thing about taking care of something this precious. I could use some help. Would you come to this study after your lessons each day and teach an old, foolish man how to be kind again? In return, I'll see to it you never miss a single day of school for the rest of your life." Camille looked to her mother, who was crying silently behind her hand, and nodded through the tears. The girl turned back, broke into a gap-toothed grin, and held out her small hand. And Augustin Devereux, who had trusted no one in 15 years, reached out and shook it. Winter turned to a mild New Orleans spring, and the study on Esplanade Avenue, the room where 15 years of cold decisions had been made, began to change one small piece at a time. The heavy velvet drapes, drawn shut for as long as any of the household staff could remember, now stood open every morning, letting the sun spill across shelves that had once held nothing but ledgers and shadow. Children's drawings began appearing on the wall beside the desk, crooked houses with too many windows, a sun with far too many rays, and one drawing pinned closest to the blotter of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a scribbled blue sky. On that same desk, among files whose contents Camille would never be allowed to know, sat a small carved wooden dove, placed exactly where a man would see it each time he signed his name. A new rhythm settled over the house. Every afternoon, once her lessons at the parish school were finished, Camille sat cross-legged on the study rug with her slate and her sums spread around her, and Augustin leaned down from his chair to walk her through each problem, patient in a way his own foreman would not have recognized. "Mr. Devereux, I don't understand this one." "Just Augustine, little one," he would say, the correction by now a private ritual between them. "Let me have a look." Margot would bring in the coffee, and in the early weeks she had kept her eyes down, set the tray, and withdrawn the way household staff had always withdrawn from that room. But the distance between the doorway and the desk shrank week by week until she began to stay. Then came supper, all three of them at a table built to seat 20, small stories and quiet jokes, Camille's laughter ringing off the plaster ceiling. For the first time in 15 years, there was laughter in the Devereux house, and the man at the head of the table was changing in ways even his own men could measure. When a young dockhand was caught skimming a few dollars from a shipment tally, an offense that had only ever ended one way under Augustine's rule, he learned the boy had 2 younger sisters at home and let him go with nothing worse than a transfer and a warning. His foreman exchanged looks in the corridor afterward. Nothing like it had happened in 15 years. He began asking Margot strange, small questions, which schoolbooks Camille needed, what a decent pair of children's shoes cost, things a man of his fortune had never once needed to know the price of. And when the housekeeper sent a boy to scrub the faint ink stain, still ghosting the desk blotter, Augustine stopped him at the door. "Leave that," he said quietly. "That's where a child taught me something I should have learned 30 years ago." But the waterfront has sharp ears, and it had begun to whisper. "Devereux has gone soft." Thibault, his foreman and the closest thing he had to a confidant, the iron-faced man who had stood at his shoulder through 15 years of quiet wars, closed the study door one evening and said the thing no one else on the payroll would dare to say aloud. "Mercy has a smell down at the wharves, Augustine. To the men circling you, it smells exactly like blood." He paused. "I'm glad for you. And I'm afraid for you." Augustine stood at the window, looking down at the courtyard garden, where Camille sat on the flagstones with her sketchbook, tongue caught between her teeth, drawing the old cistern fountain. He answered without turning around. "For 15 years I was perfectly safe, Thibault. And for 15 years I was not really alive. Now I am." He watched the girl below erase a line and start again. "Being alive costs something. There are walls 15 years in the building that come down in one afternoon because of a child's handkerchief. But it must be said, the world beyond that garden wall was not nearly so gentle as the child who had pulled the wall down. Across town, past the garden district's iron fences, in a shuttered mansion on Prytania Street, an old man sat before an unlit fireplace, turning a photograph slowly between his fingers. It had been taken from a rooftop across the avenue with a long lens, and it showed Augustin Devereux, the coldest merchant on the Mississippi, laughing in the afternoon sun, pushing a small girl on a rope swing strung from a live oak. The man holding the photograph was Corbin Rousseau, 58 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years learning that power was a thing you held the way a man holds river water, cupped tight in both hands, watching it slip through his fingers regardless. He was head of the Rousseau Trading Company, the Devereux family's rival for 2 generations, and there was something else about him that only a handful of living men knew. 15 years earlier, it was Corbin Rousseau who had found the crack in the Devereux fortress. It was Corbin who had spent months buying the loyalty of a desperate business partner named Léon Broussard, a man drowning in gambling debts of his own, and it was Corbin's order that had sent men through the door of Cotton Press No. 4 on a rainy October night, the order that had put Etienne Devereux in the ground. His only regret, he had said more than once over the years, was that the son had walked out of that fire alive. But the empire Corbin had built on that night was rotting now. His foreman muttered in the coffee houses about late payments. His credit at the bank was thinning, and one by one the smaller trading houses of New Orleans were drifting toward the Devereux Company, toward the young merchant who was quietly turning his wharves and warehouses respectable, whose business was now conducted more in daylight than Corbin's had ever been conducted in shadow. Understand this about Corbin Rousseau. He was not a greedy man. Greed had burned out of him decades earlier. He was afraid. It was the particular fear of an old wolf who can smell the day coming when his own pack turns on him. He had watched two rival merchants he had once shared a drink with be finished off by their own partners the moment they showed the smallest weakness, and he did not intend to end his days broke and forgotten in a bankruptcy court. Fear, not greed, is what makes some men truly merciless. A greedy man takes what he wants and stops. A frightened man burns everything because no amount of ash ever feels safe enough. He sat before the cold hearth, tapping one finger against the photograph. 15 years, he said to the lieutenant standing at his shoulder. 15 years, and no one has been able to touch Devereux. Do you know why? He did not wait for an answer. Because he had nothing to lose. No wife. No child. No weakness to press. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous animal God ever made. He smiled then, and his finger came to rest on Augustine's unguarded, sunlit face in the photograph, a smile no surveillance in 15 years had ever managed to capture. But look at this. Look at him now. His voice dropped, almost tender. He's finally gone and found himself something to lose. The order that followed was precise. The woman and the child were not to be touched, not yet. First, remove Devereux himself, the old way, a clean end, before the man finished dragging his fortune into full daylight and made himself untouchable, protected by lawyers and public shareholders instead of guns and silence. And Corbin had exactly the opening he needed. His information came from inside the Devereux household itself, a source close enough to the family to know its private rhythms. The message had arrived that very morning. This coming Saturday, for the first time in 15 years, Devereux would leave his own house without his usual guard. Across the city, in the warm dining room of the Esplanade Avenue house, that Saturday was being decided by a 6-year-old girl. Camille tugged at Augustine's sleeve after supper, her eyes enormous. The river lights are starting early along the levee this year, Papa Augustin. Everyone in my class has already gone. Everyone. A tragic pause. Except me. Margot set down her cup, hesitant. Augustin, you've never gone out that way, no route planned, no men watching the crowd. Thibaut won't like it at all. Augustin looked at the girl, at those pleading eyes that had once looked at a stranger they believed to be sick and seen only someone who needed help, and he smiled the kind of smile that still startled his own guards when they caught it. One evening, as an ordinary man, he said. I owe her that. He paused. I owe myself that, too. Saturday evening came warm and clear, the storm season finally broken, the river breeze carrying the smell of roasting pecans and lamp oil down toward the levee. 3 figures came down the front steps of the Esplanade Avenue house and folded themselves into the crowd drifting toward the lantern lights, Camille in the middle, one hand tucked into her mother's, the other into Augustine's. At the far end of the avenue, half hidden behind a delivery wagon, an engine turned over quietly in the dusk. The levee glittered with 1,000 paper lanterns strung between the oaks, red and gold and green, reflected in long, wavering lines across the dark water. Camille laughed, a stick of praline candy in her fist, her breath fogging faintly in the evening cool. She pointed toward the tallest lantern pole, strung with a great gilded star at its crown, and said something Augustine would never afterward be able to remember, because in that exact moment, for the first time in 15 years, Augustin Devereux was not scanning the crowd for danger. He was simply a man standing under strings of lantern light, watching a child laugh. It was the only 4 minutes of carelessness he had allowed himself in a decade and a half. 4 minutes turned out to be more than enough. A dark automobile rolled along the edge of the levee road, slow and unhurried. A window slid down. Metal caught the lantern light. From somewhere behind them, Thibault's voice tore through the music and the crowd. Down, get down. The shot cracked out over the water. Margot did not think, not for a heartbeat, not for half of one. She shoved Camille behind the stone base of the lantern pole and threw her own body in front of Augustin. 2 more shots followed. She jerked once, twice, as though struck hard from behind, and her legs folded beneath her. Blood spread dark across the paving stones under lantern light that kept swinging gently in the breeze, cheerful and indifferent to what it lit. Then came chaos, the crowd scattering in every direction, Thibault and the household guards returning fire, muzzle flashes flaring against the dusk, the dark car fishtailing away down the levee road and vanishing into the crowd of carriages beyond. Augustin dropped to his knees on the paving stones and gathered Margot into his arms, and for the first time in 15 years the hands of the coldest merchant on the Mississippi were shaking, not from rage, but from something he had no name for yet. Margot, look at me. Stay with me. Her eyes found his. Behind them, Camille was screaming for her mother, thrashing against Thibault's arms as he held her back, shielding her small body with his own. Margot's fingers closed weakly around Augustin's coat and pulled him closer, and with the last of her strength before the dark took her, she whispered, "Don't let her see you take revenge for this. She believes you're a good man. Don't prove her wrong." Her hand slipped from his lapel. The ambulance wagon tore through the evening, its bells splitting the lantern-lit street wide open, bound for Charity Hospital, toward a corridor of harsh electric light thick with the smell of carbolic soap and fear. The surgery lasted 5 hours. When the doors finally opened, the surgeon's face told the story before a single word left his mouth. She would live, but only by a margin that made hardened men suddenly religious. 1 bullet had passed clean through her shoulder. The other had stopped less than 2 inches from her heart, the width of a small carved wooden bird. Margot did not wake that first night, nor the second. For 3 days she lay in a narrow iron bed while a nurse counted her pulse on the hour, and the wealthiest man on the New Orleans waterfront sat in a wooden chair beside her and did not leave. Augustin canceled everything, every meeting, every negotiation, every piece of business that had once been the only reason he rose before dawn. For the first time in his life, he placed a single human being above the whole of his fortune. By day he gave quiet orders, the wharves watched, the dark automobile traced, every informant in the city pressed for a name, and within 2 days the trail was already bending toward the Rousseau Trading Company, exactly as he had known in his bones it would. And still he held back. No retaliation, no fire sent back across town. Thibault stood in the hospital corridor and looked at him as though looking at a stranger. "Augustin, we know enough. Give the order." "Wait," he said, his eyes never leaving the glass panel of Margot's room. "This is no longer mine alone to decide." At night, in that narrow hospital room, he learned to do things he had never done in his life. He learned to braid a small girl's hair badly, crookedly, the plait sagging off to one side like a rope come loose, and when Camille caught her reflection in the window glass, she laughed for the first time since the shooting. And Augustin decided he would braid it wrong forever if it kept bringing out that sound. He learned the exact temperature of warm milk. He learned to read fairy stories aloud in a low, graveled voice that had only ever been used before to give orders that made grown men go quiet, dragons and enchanted rivers, and a princess who outsmarted every wolf that came for her. Every night Camille fell asleep against his shoulder, and every night he sat frozen for hours afterward, his arm gone numb and aching, refusing to shift an inch for fear of waking her. One of those nights she stirred, half asleep, reached over, slid the little wooden dove from where it hung around his neck, and pressed it into his open palm, folding his fingers closed around it one by one. "Hold it tight," she murmured. "Papa will fly to you. Mama's going to be all right." A 6-year-old, comforting the most feared man on the river. And he let her. Margot woke at dawn on the 4th day. That night, once Camille had finally fallen asleep on the long bench beneath the window, Margot turned her head against the pillow and studied the man in the wooden chair, the shadowed jaw, the wrinkled shirt, the exhaustion he wore like a coat that did not fit him. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. "A man like you has 100 people he could pay to sit in that chair instead." Augustin was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, he did not look at her. He looked at his own hands. "All my life I've only known how to buy loyalty with money, with fear. Everyone who ever stood near me was either paid to stay or too afraid to leave." He turned the little dove slowly between his fingers. "No one has ever given me anything for free. Not once, not in 39 years, until a jacket, until a handkerchief. And now 2 bullets." Margot turned her face toward the window, where the street lamps blurred against the glass. "I didn't take those bullets to be owed anything," she said. "I know," he answered, his voice gone hoarse. "That's exactly why I don't know how to repay it. And that's exactly why," he stopped, then let the rest come out plain and unguarded, "I don't want to repay it. I want to owe you for the rest of my life." There was no grand speech after that, no music, none of the things love is supposed to arrive wrapped in. There was only his hand moving slowly across the white sheet and coming to rest over hers, the hand that had signed orders that made men vanish, trembling faintly over the thin fingers of a laundress, and she did not pull away. Margot came home after 3 weeks, and the Devereux house became something it had never once been in its history, a home where 3 people lived like a family no one had yet found the courage to name aloud. Sunday mornings smelled of scorched flapjacks, because Augustin insisted on cooking them himself and failed with magnificent consistency. Standing over the stove in a shirt worth more than a dockhand's monthly wage, while smoke curled toward the ceiling and Camille held up handmade scorecards from the kitchen table. In the courtyard, a wobbling bicycle traced drunken circles across the flagstones while a man who had once commanded 200 workingmen ran bent double behind it, one hand hovering near a small shoulder, shouting encouragement the whole way. Some happiness is so fragile you're almost afraid naming it will break it, and Margot watched it all from the doorway some evenings, one hand resting over the healing wound near her heart, and said nothing at all. Augustin moved faster now than his own lawyers could keep pace with. The last of the private card rooms attached to his family's older, quieter dealings were shut down and chained. Peace terms went out to the smaller trading houses of the city with such generous conditions that they were signed within days. When Thibault asked him why the sudden hurry, Augustin answered while watching Camille chase pigeons across the courtyard. "I want a life where, when that girl grows up and learns the whole truth of who I used to be, she won't be ashamed she ever put her handkerchief on my head." Thibault nodded slowly, and, because he understood, he said the thing that needed saying, the warning that would come true, word for word. "Then move carefully, Augustin. A man retreating halfway is showing his back to every enemy he ever made. A wounded wolf is a hunted wolf." Across town, behind the shuttered windows on Prytania Street, that hunted wolf's enemy was learning exactly how right Thibault had been. The failed shooting at the levee had made Corbin Rousseau's position far worse than it had ever been. His own men whispered in back rooms about an old fool who could not finish a target standing still under lantern light. 2 of the smaller families in his network had stopped returning his calls. His debts were coming due, and the money to cover them simply was not there, while every week Devereux grew more legitimate, more protected, harder to reach. Then Corbin's source inside the household sent 2 pieces of information. The first, Devereux's legal transformation of the business was only weeks from finished, after which there would be nothing left worth seizing, only paper, lawyers, shareholders. The second, Devereux now had a woman and a child he loved more than the whole of his fortune. Corbin stood before his cold hearth for a long while, watching nothing at all, and when he finally spoke, the words came out quiet and almost gentle, the most chilling sentence of his long, chilling life. "Stop shooting at the wolf." He turned to his lieutenant. "Take what the wolf carries in its mouth. It will kneel down on its own." The new plan was simple, and it was final. Take the woman and the child. Force Devereux to sign over every wharf, every warehouse, every shipping contract his family had ever held, and make him deliver the signature himself, alone, and then finish what should have been finished 15 years ago in the rain at Cotton Press No. 4. Thursday afternoon arrived ordinary as every Thursday before it. Margot took Camille's hand and set out for the French market 3 blocks from the house, the same small errand she made every week, choosing oranges, counting change, being nobody in particular for one quiet hour. It was the one scrap of ordinary life she had refused to give up. Augustin waved from the study window. Camille waved back with her whole arm, and on her small wrist, catching the afternoon light, sat the little wooden dove on its leather cord, borrowed that morning with a solemn promise to return it by supper. Down the block, the street's one police callbox light went dark for exactly 4 minutes. No one noticed. A delivery cart sat parked along the curb all afternoon, though no one on that street had ordered a delivery. In the study, Augustin sat reading the final stack of transfer papers, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. Across the room, Margot's line rang out from his own telephone and went unanswered. Once, twice, 3 times. He looked up from the pages. The coffee had gone cold, and he knew, with the same animal instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years, that somewhere out there in that ordinary Thursday afternoon something had just broken. Guards were out through the gates within 3 minutes. They found the scene 4 blocks down, and it was silent in a way that made hardened men speak in whispers. A basket of oranges overturned, the fruit scattered across the cobblestones like drops of blood. A child's shoe on its side near the gutter. And there, on the trampled ground, the little wooden dove on its broken cord. Camille had slipped it from her wrist and let it fall. Deliberately. A 6-year-old girl, in the most frightening moment of her short life, had kept her head clear enough to leave behind her father's bird as a marker, a message, a trail for the one person she knew would come looking. Smart and brave and entirely her mother's daughter. Augustin knelt in the middle of the street and picked up the little dove with both hands, the way a man lifts something holy. It took less than an hour of quiet, careful questions to trace how Rousseau had known the household's one unguarded routine, the Thursday walk, the 4 minutes of darkness over the call box. The answer, when it came, hurt more than he had expected. Josephine, the family's longtime cook, 20 years in the Devereux kitchen, a woman who had fed his father his last supper before that final meeting in the rain. Her grown son owed $60,000 to a cardroom that, it turned out, belonged quietly to Corbin Rousseau, who had been holding that debt over her like a blade for months. They brought her into the study, and she went down on her knees, an old woman weeping into her own hands, while the room full of hard men held its breath, waiting for the sentence, because the old unwritten law of the docks allowed for only one. Augustin looked down at her for a long time, and what he saw was not a traitor. He saw a frightened parent cornered by a debt she had never chosen, protecting her child the only way she knew how. He thought of Camille, of a small voice once saying sick is still sick, even the guilty, even the frightened, even the ones who wound you. Get up, Josephine, he said quietly. The room stirred in disbelief. You're going to keep speaking to Rousseau exactly as before. He stepped closer, and his eyes were no longer gentle. Except from this hour forward, every word you carry to him comes from me. The enemy's own card had just become his. That night, alone in the study, Augustin stood at the window where he had waved to Camille that afternoon and slid the little wooden dove onto its cord around his neck, closing his fist around it until the carved wing bit into his palm. "You were right, little one," he murmured to the empty room. "Hold it tight when you're afraid." "I've been afraid for 15 years, afraid of trusting anyone at all." He looked out toward the dark ribbon of the river, toward the old warehouses where the lights burned dim against the night. "Tonight, that's finished." The family council convened within the hour, and the meeting room came near to boiling over. "It's a trap, Augustin. You walk in, you don't walk out. The moment you sign, all three of you are dead. That's simply how it's done." "We invented how it's done," Augustin said. And then one of the older men, a foreman who had served his father before him, slammed a fist on the table. "No one trades an entire fortune for a housekeeper and another man's child. Your father built this company with sweat and blood." The room went dead quiet. Augustin looked at the old man for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was heavier than the table they all sat around. "My father died with no one left he could trust, betrayed by a man he called his own brother, in a warehouse in the rain." He rose to his feet. "I will not die that way. And I will not live that way, not for one more day." Late that night, alone in the study, he opened the desk drawer and drew out a sealed envelope. He held it out to Thibault. "Only to be opened if I don't come back. Everything is arranged inside, the succession, the accounts, provisions for Margot and Camille for the rest of their lives. If the worst happens, you answer to no one but them." Thibault, a man forged from 15 years of quiet wars at Augustin's shoulder, a man who had never once bowed his head to anyone outside of habit, looked at the envelope for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, lowered himself onto one knee. "For 15 years I followed you because I was afraid," he said quietly. "Tonight I follow you because I'm proud to." It had taken Augustin Devereux 39 years to learn the difference between the two, and in the end he had learned it from a 6-year-old girl with a wooden bird. They had spoken through the plan only briefly, men who had already rehearsed it in low voices a dozen times. False word had been flowing through Josephine for 2 days, steady and believable, that Devereux reinforcements were massing at a warehouse on the far side of the turning basin, positioning to strike. After the exchange, Rousseau would do exactly what any commander in his place would do, pull his main force away from Cotton Press No. 4 to intercept a phantom army before it could move. What Corbin Rousseau could not know was that there was no army waiting anywhere on the far side of the basin. There never had been. Thibault's men were already sealed inside the cotton bales stacked along the warehouse walls, motionless in the dark since 12 hours before the deadline had even been delivered, waiting on a single signal. Dawn came up gray and still over Cotton Press No. 4, the same cracked concrete yard where 15 years before Devereux blood had first soaked into the ground. A single automobile rolled slowly onto the yard and cut its engine. Augustin stepped out alone, both hands raised, holding nothing but a leather document case above his head, unarmed, and around his neck, catching the gray morning light, a child's small wooden dove on its cord. From a shattered upper window, Corbin watched and counted, no convoy trailing behind, no rifles on the neighboring rooftops, nothing at all. The wolf had come alone after all, carrying its whole fortune in a leather case. He smiled, slow and satisfied, in the dark above. What he did not know was that for 12 hours already, he had been the one standing inside the cage. The warehouse doors groaned open. 2 lines of gun barrels tracked Augustin as he crossed the floor, and he did not slow his pace, did not hurry it either, his footsteps echoing off the same concrete that had drunk his father's blood. He set the leather case down on a wooden crate at the center of the floor, signed the final page, and slid the stack across. "Every wharf, every warehouse, every route," he said flatly. "Release them." Corbin descended the metal stairs, unhurried, savoring it, and picked up the papers, leafing through them slowly. Real signatures, real seals, real surrender. He let out a dry, admiring laugh. "Your father's own hand, almost exactly." Then the courtesy drained from his face entirely. "But you don't honestly think I intend to leave you alive to come for revenge, do you, Devereux?" He raised a hand to signal his men, and in that exact instant his eyes flicked once across the warehouse floor. The thin line of guards along the far wall, too thin, far too thin. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, half a heartbeat too late. Augustine's fist closed around the little wooden dove, the signal. The cotton bales blew open all at once, and Thibault's men, 12 hours motionless in the cold dark, poured out like a black tide. Gunfire tore through the shadows, glass exploded from the upper windows in glittering sheets, and a stray tracer caught the stacked bales, fire crawling up the dry cotton like a living thing. Augustin was already moving through the crossfire toward the storage rooms at the rear of the building, a bullet catching his left shoulder, staggering him against a steel drum before he pushed on, blood soaking hot down his sleeve. He reared back and kicked the storage door open. Margot and Camille were huddled in the corner, alive, and the guard beside them spun with his weapon rising, and Augustin did the only thing there was time left to do, threw his own body between the gun and the two of them, arms spread wide, making himself the wall. The circle had come full around at last, the man Margot once shielded now standing as the shield in turn. And this time, Camille saw all of it, saw the man who had once faked illness in a chair place himself squarely in front of a bullet meant for her. The shot never came. Thibault appeared in the doorway behind the guard and dropped him with a single motion. Out in the warehouse, the fight was already collapsing. The fire had reached the rafters, and Rousseau's soldiers, men whose loyalty had only ever been rented with fear, did exactly what rented loyalty does the moment the ledger flips. They ran, trampling one another toward the doors. Corbin stood alone in the smoke, screaming at them to hold their ground, and a stray round fired blind by one of his own panicking men caught him square in the chest. He went down among the burning bales, the fate that always waits for a man who spends a lifetime buying loyalty with fear alone. Augustin crossed the warehouse floor and stood over him. Corbin was still breathing, shallow and wet, and both men knew it would not be for much longer. His eyes found Augustin's face, and his mouth pulled into something between a grimace and a smile. "Broussard," he rasped. "It was me. I bought him 15 years ago." A wet red laugh. "My only regret is we missed the sun." There it was at last, the final confession, the hand behind the hand that had killed Etienne Devereux. 15 years of grief rose up Augustin's spine like a scream, and his revolver was in his hand before he even remembered drawing it, the barrel lowering to the dying man's forehead, his fingers settling on the trigger. Every drop of blood in him howled for it. He had every reason on this earth. And then he felt a pair of eyes on his back, Camille, standing in the doorway wrapped in her mother's arms, watching him with the very same eyes that had once looked at the coldest man on the river and seen only someone who was sick and needed tending. Don't prove her wrong. Augustin lowered the gun. He let it hang at his side, and he stood there, and he did nothing, and the doing of nothing was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. The girl did not see him take his revenge. She saw him choose not to, with every reason in the world burning in his open hand. Corbin's gaze slid past Augustin and found the small figure in the doorway one last time. His lips moved once more, the words riding out on his final breath. The little one, he murmured, was right. Sick. His eyes stayed open, but Corbin Rousseau was gone, and he had left this world not as a monster, but as a man who had simply been cold for 50 years and never once found anyone to fan it away. Augustin dropped to his knees in the ash and smoke, pulling Margot and Camille against him with his good arm. The girl pressed her small palm to his cheek, checking, the way children check, that he was real, that he was there. He was. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and said the 3 simplest words of his life. Let's go home. The shot never came. Thibault appeared in the doorway behind the guard and dropped him with a single motion. Out in the warehouse, the fight was already collapsing. The fire had reached the rafters, and Rousseau's soldiers, men whose loyalty had only ever been rented with fear, did exactly what rented loyalty does the moment the ledger flips. They ran, trampling one another toward the doors. Corbin stood alone in the smoke, screaming at them to hold their ground, and a stray round fired blind by one of his own panicking men caught him square in the chest. He went down among the burning bales, the fate that always waits for a man who spends a lifetime buying loyalty with fear alone. Augustin crossed the warehouse floor and stood over him. Corbin was still breathing, shallow and wet, and both men knew it would not be for much longer. His eyes found Augustin's face, and his mouth pulled into something between a grimace and a smile. "Broussard," he rasped. "It was me. I bought him 15 years ago." A wet red laugh. "My only regret is we missed the sun." There it was at last, the final confession, the hand behind the hand that had killed Augustin Devereux. 15 years of grief rose up Augustin's spine like a scream, and his revolver was in his hand before he even remembered drawing it, the barrel lowering to the dying man's forehead, his fingers settling on the trigger. Every drop of blood in him howled for it. He had every reason on this earth. And then he felt a pair of eyes on his back, Camille, standing in the doorway wrapped in her mother's arms, watching him with the very same eyes that had once looked at the coldest man on the river and seen only someone who was sick and needed tending. Don't prove her wrong. Augustin lowered the gun. He let it hang at his side, and he stood there, and he did nothing, and the doing of nothing was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. The girl did not see him take his revenge. She saw him choose not to, with every reason in the world burning in his open hand. Corbin's gaze slid past Augustin and found the small figure in the doorway one last time. His lips moved once more, the words riding out on his final breath. The little one, he murmured, was right. Sick. His eyes stayed open, but Corbin Rousseau was gone, and he had left this world not as a monster, but as a man who had simply been cold for 50 years and never once found anyone to fan it away. Augustin dropped to his knees in the ash and smoke, pulling Margot and Camille against him with his good arm. The girl pressed her small palm to his cheek, checking, the way children check, that he was real, that he was there. He was. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and said the 3 simplest words of his life. Let's go home.